And so I say that social media has played an active role or enabling a role because it wasn't intentionally used for that purpose of helping to advance these other forms of attack against countries. And now we're looking at what are the possibilities of attacks on critical infrastructure.
Right. Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Global and National Security Institute Speaker Series. I'm Dr. Tad Schnoffer here with GNSI at the University of South Florida. Today, we're joined by Dr. Heather Ashby, a principal consultant at the Corner Alliance's support for Homeland Security's Research and Development Directorate. Her prior position was Associate Director at the United States Institute of Peace. Her research interests include a focus on Russia, including its relationships with countries around the world. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited.
Well, first, why don't we talk about what got you interested in, national security and then specifically Russia and its interactions with countries outside of Europe?
And so it goes back to undergrad, in which I was taking a world literature class. A book by Dostoevsky was assigned, and I was just fascinated from reading that book. And I was like, oh, I want to learn more about the history of this country that could trigger such a depressing but insightful book. And so from there, my interest in Russia extended to international affairs. And so after college and then grad school, I was fortunate to receive the Boren Fellowship, which allowed me to enter the government. And from there, I just continued on with an interest in national security, bouncing around in different parts of DHS, Department of Homeland Security, focused on international and domestic issues. And then during COVID, I had the opportunity to receive a job from the U.S. Institute of Peace. And from there, I was excited about the opportunity to work with so many different regional experts at the U.S. Institute of Peace, receive their insights, and from those discussions, looking at how Russia was active in various regions of the world.
So what's the most interesting region Russia's active in right now? One that's not really covered in the news, I should say.
I would say Latin America.
Really? Yeah. So how so?
I think it's because it's such a low-level presence, and some of it has been historical, that they've just been there over time, and no one has really dug deeply into it. And so when I was at the U.S. Institute of Peace, I oversaw the issuing of a report by Douglas Farah and Roman Ortiz, which you could find on USIP's website. Even though I'm not employed by them, I still direct you to their website. And they covered a lot of interest and information about Russia's presence in Latin America, from Alexander Dugin, this prominent intellectual who's a strong nationalist, racist, and how his ideas are spreading in Latin America. He speaks Spanish, Portuguese, and so he conducts these interviews on Spanish and Portuguese TV and captures some of the imagination of elites in the region.
Wow. So what's the goal of that, to bring these elites over to kind of Russia's viewpoint, or just to make them disinterested in the West, or what's that look like?
Both.
Wow, okay.
So both to attack the West, particularly the United States, because of how Latin America has been viewed in U.S. national security and foreign policy, as well as to promote Russian interests. And sometimes it overlaps with Iranian interests and Chinese interests, which are also active in that region of the world. And so Russia just keeps finding ways, low-level ways, because they don't have that much money or options in terms of trade. And so they involve themselves in trying to capture elites, political party to political party engagement, funding for political parties, disinformation efforts, capturing elites. And so those are along the lines of how they've been active in Latin America.
It's really interesting. Have they used these same strategies elsewhere in the world? We hear about the Wagner Group and these private security companies around the world that Russia employs. Are they part of this strategy?
Yes, and I would say that one thing about Russia is it sort of has a toolbox that it pulls from.
Right. Yeah.
And so a couple of years ago, I guess it's almost 10 years ago now, in 2016, the Center for Strategic and International Studies released a report about Russia's toolbox in Europe. And so I read that report and then noticed similarities of how they were operated in different parts of the world, such as trying to have the United Russia Party that Putin's a part of, to the extent you could say he's a part of a party.
Right.
build partnerships with other parties in different parts of the world, and that has happened in Africa, as well as looking at efforts of how you can build relationships between elites. And so that could be individuals who come from a certain political class inviting people to study in Russia. And so you had African students, and that's been going on for decades. And it's something that I looked into with my dissertation. And of course, you have private military companies, and Wagner has received the most attention. Previously, they were active in Venezuela, and their roles could be active combat in military operations to combat terrorism, like they did in Mozambique, adversaries in conflict environments such as Central African Republic, or you could look at Mali as well, of combating extremists. Or you could have them serve as sort of security for the authoritarian individual in power and providing that type of security support. At the same time, they're engaging in massive extraction of natural resources in those countries to help pay for their operations. Some of those funds go back to Moscow and support Putin and his cronies.
So we really don't see so much hard power part of this strategy. It's more of a soft power element. So I remember specifically during the Soviet Union times that you have a lot of leaders studying in the Czech Republic or Warsaw Pact allies, and then they go back and take that education back to their home country. And then as those young students rise in prominence in their respective home countries, then they have a closer tie to, say, the Soviets, or in this case, the Russians. Is that the goal, like a long-term strategy?
I think so. And so there's often this debate among Russia experts about whether Russia has a strategy or they're more opportunistic.
Sure.
And I would say there's a little bit of both. They're not just one or the other. And so they look for opportunities as they present themselves and try to take advantage of it. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not, as well as having more longer-term strategy. One of their longer-term strategies that failed was trying to have a naval base in Sudan on the Red Sea. And so that didn't materialize as much as they want, but they still managed to build relationships with the parties in the conflict in Sudan, as well as the government in Ethiopia, which has cultural ties to Russia with Orthodox Christianity, and then Egypt, which is one of Russia's strongest bilateral partners. I think out of any country, really, is you have this long history going back to the Soviet period. You have cultural institutions, soft power within Egypt, and then you have military engagement. And I would say in between the soft and hard power, one area that people don't look at with Russia is the police surveillance intelligence engagement. And so that's something that I've been trying to track to see how that is taking shape in sort of Russia's surveillance, authoritarian diplomacy in terms of, oh, you're an authoritarian. Look at Putin. He's managed to stay in power so long. Ask us how, and we'll share that information with you.
So it's like Putin's handbook, how to stay in power type thing?
And so I've been tracking that with different parts of the world. I've seen that with like information sharing agreements between security forces in Mozambique. Nicaragua is a big place for it, in addition to other activities that Russia engages in Nicaragua, such as just doing something soft power, like here are some buses. You needed some buses for your society. We provided them to you.
So it's Russia's way to extend influence without having to, again, spend a ton of money per se, or is it also part of, we've heard these terms in recent years of hybrid warfare or gray zone, or is it just soft power? Is there some other concept at play here, or is it, again, just opportunistic Russian operations?
Yeah, I think I lean on a phrase that Mark Galeotti, a prominent Russian scholar, an expert focuses on, and he has this book out called The Weaponization of Everything, and he's not paying me. I just appreciate Galeotti's opinions. And so what he notices is Russia is an example of this, in which they turn everything into an aspect of a total war.
Sure.
And so I see Russian activities as this broad spectrum of total war. And I think from our perspective, we may call it hybrid or gray zone. But for them, it's their larger effort to advance these multipolar view of the world, have their spheres of influence, as well as lessen the power of the United States and the West.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, he has a great podcast too. as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, it's interesting because again, the U.S. we try to put words on and try to conceptualize it, but it's difficult when maybe the adversary is just using pretty much whatever comes up and what's available.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that worries me about the time period that we find ourselves in and where we're headed with so many challenges to the rules-based international order and the difficulties of achieving peace or even conceiving of peace, that this era of total war in which anything is on the table to attack an adversary without going necessarily to military conflict is taking shape.
When it seems like technology's made it so much easier to reach into a country and cause dismay or harm or misinformation because of cyber or whatever type of attacks, what role is technology playing in this shift to more like soft power influence?
I think it's playing a very prominent role. One is that so much of information on a citizen of a country is available online.
Yeah.
And so that enables effective targeting in various ways, whether it's person-to-person targeting, the old spy ways of honey trapping someone, or it could be online and attacking communities and inflaming conflict and touching into some of the more sensitive issues that of tension within a society. And so I say that social media has played an active role or enabling a role because it wasn't intentionally used for that purpose of helping to advance these other forms of attack against countries. And now we're looking at what are the possibilities of attacks on critical infrastructure. Microsoft is very good about their blog online of pointing out some of the attacks that are taking place and other networks, whether it's Iranian, Chinese, or Russian. And so I like to, read them to see what's going on. And so they had a recent report about Iranian, Russian, and Chinese actors using generative AI, trying to study it more and seeing what are the possibilities there. I was just reading the AI executive order from Biden, and one of the key aspects of that is protection of critical infrastructure. And I think that could be more vulnerable the more sophisticated technology becomes. And so, once again, it's not military to military, it's attacking the electrical grid and other means of how we function in our daily lives.
Well, because as you mentioned, if you have this full toolkit of being able to attack everywhere in different means, that means you have the proper response is a total defense. Yeah. So even counties or cities would have to know what to do if they suffer a major cyber attack.
Yes, definitely, as well as voting systems.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, if voting systems are hacked somehow or other ways of influencing voting, whether it's the individuals providing disinformation online about where a polling place is or so forth and misrepresenting a candidate's position, that could influence how that particular area of critical infrastructure that we don't think about as much as something more solidified, such as the electrical grid, nuclear power.
Sure, and we've seen some in recent elections, deep fake videos of candidates not actually saying what their platform is, and that influencing voters.
Yes, definitely, and robocalls.
Right. Oh, robocalls. Yeah, absolutely. So how is AI is AI more the same, just easier for people to implement these type of attacks or aggression, or is it something completely new?
I think it's making it easier in terms of lowering the cost and making it more available. And so really it's not states and states against each other. It's non-state actors becoming more involved. And if we go back and think about the war on terror, we were concerned about non-state actors and mainly focused on terrorists. But now it could be anyone who could have some social or software engineering knowledge and could make use of these tools.
Yeah, so I guess they could even hold a city grid for hostage or something like that.
Yes, and coming from Baltimore, that actually happened to the water system in Baltimore.
Really? Yeah.
There was an attack on the software that was managing the water system in Baltimore, and so they couldn't release any bills because they were being held for ransom of gaining access to it. And so for months and months, I didn't have to pay my water bill because the system was held hostage. By a nefarious actor.
Do you know how that resolved itself? Was it was like the FBI that came in and resolved it, or do you know how that
I can't remember whether they end up just paying for the ransom, which some organizations and companies do without any alternative.
Is there a role for governments to kind of step up? So to break it down, what are states doing, and then / what's the international community doing to help address these
Yeah,
issues?
I think one of the areas is Department of Homeland Security. That's a key function for them, is to provide this expertise and training to state, local, and tribal governments and to help increase their capacity. And so that happens through different agencies within the Department of Homeland Security.
Sure.
I think it would be important if the federal government provided more resources to educate state and local governments, because they don't have the resources to hire the best cybersecurity experts to protect their systems. The other is public-private partnerships. So working with companies such as Microsoft, as well as other companies that provide protection for systems or can spot nefarious activities online. That's another area. Within the international arena, I think that's one of the challenges that's taken shape, is what path are we going down? Is it more the rules-based international order that's been in existence for decades upon decades? Or is it going to be more of a Russian-Chinese approach, which is more authoritarian, centralized government controlling everything? And so that's sort of going to play out this year with all these discussions about how AI should be governed, and that could extend more broadly to technology. I know for the United States, it looks for allies and other interested partner countries to join together and come up with some rules of the road, some frameworks to address some of these issues.
So how do you see that being enforced? Let's say we have a rule where you're not supposed to create deep fake videos or something like that. How would a country or an international organization be able to enforce that?
Honor system.
Honestly, yes. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that's what a lot of international laws go off of.
Yeah, exactly. And so even if you sign the treaty, it's really up to the country to say, we're committed not to violate this international rule. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that the UN is facing. You have all these rules. You have the UN Charter. You have humanitarian or human rights law.
Sure.
But it's all up to countries whether they're going to adhere to it or not, even if they did sign a treaty. And so it'll be interesting along this year, because UN is very active in trying to put together a framework for AI governance, whether they succeed, and if they succeed, whether countries actually listen to them and follow them.
Right. Well, it might be establishing norms like the world has with like chemical weapons, say, or maybe some of these other things where it keeps most actors at least in line.
Yeah, and I would say in that situation, China's not a part of those type of treaty agreements that the U.S. government over the decades has built with the Russians, even though the Russians are trying to pull out of those agreements. And so that's something else to consider, whether we need some type of treaty framework, and that could be multilateral, bilateral, even though that would be pretty extensive. But we could do it with the biggest actors within the space and most technologically advanced countries of building those type of rules of the road frameworks. Late last year, the Biden administration, through the State Department's Bureau of International Security and Arms Control, released a framework that a number of countries have signed on the responsible use of AI for military purposes.
Sure. And do we see that being fulfilled? Are militaries following that responsible use?
It's only been a couple of months. I think it was October-November timeframe. And so this year we'll see how it plays out and whether more countries sign up for it. Notably, if I recall correctly, Ukraine signed up for it, but Israel didn't.
Oh, interesting.
With all the discussion about AI use by the Israelis in the war in Gaza.
And part of that probably discusses where you have a human in the loop, when do you let AI make decisions, and then when do you always have a human making the final decision? Do you know how that looks on these agreements?
I think for at least not necessarily in agreements, but for the Israelis, they emphasize that AI gathers all the data from various movements of groups, in this case Hamas on the ground, and helps come to some conclusions about what would be good targets. And then an individual makes a decision about whether that target moves forward for approval.
Right.
And so I see that within the broader international framework of making sure that individuals, and this has come up in discussions, make sure an individual makes the final decisions and not the technology.
Right. So what we're seeing is the role of AI being more of an analytical device, very fast, can compute averages and statistics very quickly, but there's still a human decision maker at the end that's going to make press the button, if you will.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Hopefully it remains that. Right.
So far that's the case, but who knows? And that's why it's so important, this global year of elections, because whoever's voted into power in these various countries, and of course some countries it's just a sham election like Russia,
Right.
will determine what those types of partnerships, what type of decisions are going to be made around technology for the next 5, 6, 7 years, depending on the length of term for the legislatures or for president, prime minister.
Right. And do you feel that some of these countries are able to use AI to shore up the regime? So whether that's Russia or maybe some other authoritarian states where AI actually benefits their ability to control the population?
I think so. And this has come up with China about their advanced surveillance AI capabilities of knowing where people are at given moments to track their locations, as well as to gather all that data. And you describe it as some experts as a social engineer and to rank people.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that's a way of maintaining control over a population. There are other examples of AI surveillance use. One is in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan that's been going on for the longest time. And it was used to surveil activists, peace activists, who were trying to advance a different approach to resolving the conflict.
And what we're talking about here for artificial intelligence is really just, a program that's able to accumulate data and then make and inform, in this case, maybe a law enforcement of China or something like that. And where's the AI, in this case, getting the data from? Is it from social media accounts of these individuals or TikTok videos?
It could vary. It could be whatever is on the internet.
Right.
So in the case of Ukraine, Clearview AI and Palantir have been providing advanced technology support to the Ukrainian government. And some of that is helping them with their military decision making by gathering a lot of information, geospatial information, as well as other details, compiling it together and allowing them to review it to determine what type of military decisions they're making. And another area, Clearview AI is scanning the faces of Russian soldiers who have perpetrated war crimes against Ukrainians and trying to identify them by scanning the internet for all these images to match who is this individual with a name, so then they can move forward with a war crimes case.
That's really intense.
Yeah.
So we have talked a lot about the kind of threats and the dangers of AI across the world. So is there some good that can come out of this technology?
Yes, there is good. And I hope that moving forward that people could start to brainstorm and be creative about its applications. I think within the business community, it's very much accelerating.
Sure.
Last week, someone's like, why don't you just have AI help you make a PowerPoint?
Right.
I was like, I didn't know it could do that.
Yeah.
So you could go and chat GPT, put in some details like generate this into a PowerPoint. And it could do that, though there were shortcomings because the images that they created for it wouldn't actually fit in the PowerPoint.
Right.
And it kept saying, I failed.
Yeah. Oops.
Yeah. So in that way, in the business world, there are positive applications. I think other ways, the UN is thinking about positive use cases. And that's going to come out over the course of this year as they have their AI advisory board that's going to culminate in a report shortly before the Summit of the Future that's taking place in September 2024, which is around the same time the UN General Assembly meets.
Right.
And so that's something that I've been paying attention to see how that develops. And one application that they talked about for positive use cases is early warning. And so that could be used in climate change by inputting a lot of data about how the environment has changed in a given region. Can you then anticipate with additional information that's more up to date what's going to happen in the future, so you can help regions prepare for what certain disasters and when potentially it could take place. You can also see early warning in a conflict environment. So we talk about disinformation and misinformation on social media platforms. You could try to use AI to scan social media platforms for looking at hate speech and other inflammatory terms in the middle of before a conflict takes place to see whether this is going to trigger violence. And so that could be an early warning system. And combine that with other information. If individuals, security, military, militias are moving, you combine that all together, and that can help provide a broader picture for people looking into conflicts and how to prevent conflicts or mitigate the damage once they do start.
Right. So what the AI in this case is doing, it's able the data you put in is what you're going to get out. So if you have good data, and then it's able to tell you, hey, there's a spike in hate speech, or there's a spike in people talking about massing in a certain location or something like that. And it gives responders an early warning notice.
Yes, definitely. And another use case could be the use of drones. And so the war in Ukraine and Israel's war in Gaza has received a lot of attention for autonomous weapons and AI use in drones. And so in the case of drones, it could be used to monitor a conflict line.
Wow.
And because it's so difficult for putting troops there who could be in the way of the violence taking place, you could use drones to monitor the movement of troops, see who fired first, and it could process the information and help those who are doing a monitoring mission to better understand what's taking place.
Wow. So AI is going to be part of pretty much everyday life across the board on battlefields, but also, as we mentioned, just in our social media or in our businesses.
Yes, I think so. And I think it's a situation where it's not going away. It's going to continue to advance. And so it's incumbent upon society to start thinking about what could be some positive uses and to mitigate any potential harms to try to get ahead of it, because they're just going to keep evolving. So it won't be a set of risks that are always there and will always exist. It's going to evolve over time. And so we could see the same thing about positive cases, that they could evolve over time, and start thinking about some of the challenges within society. What role can technology and AI specifically play to help address that?
Sure. And how do you see the future going for 2024 and even beyond when we talk about AI and its development?
I think for this year, it will be interesting to see which model of AI governance really moves forward. Is it more the nationalist way? Brazil has been looking into AI governance. The U.S. has its executive order, which is more hands-off and not a formal law. You have the EU, which is a more formal law and covering a whole region. Or you have the UN's approach, which is multi-stakeholder. Let's bring different actors to the table and have these conversations and hope that
hope it works out.
it works out. Or you want to take the Chinese approach, which is more centralized. And so I think this goes back to some of the arguments people made about the internet, about how open should the internet be? Should it be more closed off or open? And we see largely, with some exceptions, large exceptions, that it's mainly open. And the Chinese model hasn't picked up as much globally. And so I think that's going to be something to watch in 2024 for AI governance, is about what are these different models taking shape for governing AI, and what approach will countries attach themselves to.
And so what does that mean for information online when AI can be programmed and alter information so quickly or produce information so quickly? Are we going to be overwhelmed with our online, surfing with just AI-produced text, and we won't know what's necessarily true, what AI came up with, because you just can't verify everything? Or?
Yes, I think that's a challenge.
Wow.
And so that's one of the things in the executive order from the current presidential administration is, for at least for images, can you watermark them?
Right.
Then at the state level, various states are looking into deep fakes after what happened that rose into prominence with the images of Taylor Swift that circulated from Telegram to X Twitter. And so now states are more actively pushing banning on deep fakes, and that could go throughout the so-called supply chain of deep fakes, about who's involved in making that image, what website is given the technology, so who could be held liable along the way. And so there are various states looking into that in terms of deep fakes. And so I think it's going to vary across the board until there may be, at least in the United States, there's going to be an overarching AI law. Otherwise, various states are going to take different approaches to privacy, deep fakes, social media, content moderation, and looking at social media companies, it'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court rules on a series of cases about content moderation and social media use this summer.
So and we already have issues with this already with content online and what you can trust and not trust. So how's that going to look in the future with AI? Like how is the average user going to know what to trust?
It's going to be the same situation now, possibly accelerated. There was the controversy with Sports Illustrated before the publication collapsed recently that they were using AI to generate a lot of their articles.
Really?
And I'm not sure that they were being truthful that AI was writing the articles for them.
Right.
And so that's going to be a situation in which publications, students
Oh, yeah,
at
of
a
course.
university
Yeah.
should admit when they're using AI for their work.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see whether people come forward to have some watermarking on images or have some are truthful about when AI is playing a role in whatever publication is coming out. I read the Daily Mail through the app forum. I have no shame about that, even though it's problematic. I understand, but I like celebrity gossip. And one of the recommendations for other publications is you can see all these clickbaits.
Wow.
And
yeah.
I'm pretty sure those are AI generated
yeah.
with the images. Some of it I could tell because it was an image of a celebrity that was redone to not show attribution to that celebrity, but look very similar.
Wow.
And so it creates this clickbait. It's like, oh, look at this scarf to direct you to that particular website. And so I think you're going to see more of that. And hopefully people don't give in to the clickbait of those articles being generated in fake websites that are just trying to sell you something or steal your information or be scammy.
Right. So whether if it's Russian misinformation or it's a company just trying to get you to buy something, how is the American public or just the public in general, I guess, going to be able to respond to that? Is it going to be education? Is it going to be like, are we all going to have classes on, what to look for?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
I think that's the best approach to it, is to start educating people as young as possible, especially since the young people coming of age are so enmeshed in this online world, is to help educate them and to think critically about what are you looking at? Can you verify what you're looking at from another source? And if you could do that, then I think that could help go a long way, or if people not being so susceptible to misinformation and disinformation is more education.
Okay. And then, checking your sources and just not being, I guess, trustworthy, trusting everything at first sight.
Yeah, and it's the challenge of what sources do you check to validate what you're looking at.
I guess you got to go to the library and have something in print. So, at least if it was before a certain time, it wasn't ChatGPT.
Yeah, I'll be curious what you tell your students.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think one of the big things is making sure that people, as classes look to evolve, is one, you need to do research, but you also need to do a lot of presentations where you're not just doing or writing a paper where they can lean on these devices. They need to be able to formulate arguments verbally. And I think that's where education is going to have to go, is a lot more verbal. Back in the old days, like the 60s, when you had a verbal exam or an oral exam.
Oh.
Because there you can't use, you can use ChatGPT, I guess, to create the study material, but either you're the one up in front of the class having to present.
Yeah, and there's still challenges with generative AI. There was a controversy over Gemini.
Right, yeah. So
recently. But also when I used ChatGPT, you gave me a summary, and I was like, okay, can you provide the sources of where you pull this from? And they're like, well, you could just go online and look at these sources to see to verify what I wrote. And I was like, okay.
Right.
And so all those type of generative AI products are going to continue to evolve, and they have a lot of hiccups now that we need to educate people and make them more aware of it, that this isn't a single source of truth.
Right.
It's a source of information. And I was reading an article recently that said that Wikipedia is still around.
Right, yeah, exactly.
It's still standing strong with everything going on, and it does have citations to the information that it's presenting.
Right.
And so Wikipedia is always an option. Just go to the source.
Yeah,
that it
double
links
check
to.
that sources, right. Well, I think that's one of the things with ChatGPT is that sometimes I think there's reporting, or there has been, that it will create sources based off what it thinks the person searching actually wants to see. So it might cite a source and create the source as well. So all of a sudden you have a double line of ChatGPT created sources. So it looks official, but it's not.
Yeah, and so that's another big challenge.
Yeah.
And I think our education system at all levels, from elementary through college, is going to have to catch up to how to prepare professors, teachers to address these issues, because I think they're going to be such a key part of how we address these challenges.
Right, and that's going to be important to kind of take us back to the beginning of the conversation, is if we do not have an educated citizenry, it's going to be harder to fend off misinformation campaigns from adversaries around the world.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, and to wrap up here with our last question, how do you see the world and AI, whether if it's in conflict or at home, how do you see that developing by region? This is Latin America, and then we'll go around the world real quick.
Yeah, I think Latin America will be interesting based on how it shakes out with different governments. It always goes through whether they want a socialist in power or someone more conservative.
Right.
That's going to be that type of back and forth is going to shape how they approach these issues. Right. But I think because the U.S. is such a large overshadowing power there, that it will most likely adhere to a more rules-based approach in that area. I think for Africa, it's up in the air right now. The African Union is looking at AI governance, but you also have individual states at different levels of capacity on technology. Some don't even have strong internet access, so it's hard to then talk about AI governance. And so that's going to be a critical issue, I think, for a lot of philanthropic organizations and international development organizations, is to try to accelerate, to the extent they can, internet access and then digital literacy alongside of it. I think in the Middle East, you have the UAE and Saudi Arabia developing their own generative AI based on whatever data they're gathering. And as we know, there are really no democracies in the Middle East.
Right.
And so that's going to shape how that plays out. But you also have a tremendous amount of wealth, no questioning of that wealth, in the sense that UAE has been a transit country for Russian oligarchs who want to hide their funds.
Right.
And so you're going to get less of that rules-based approach. And China is also active in the Middle East. I think for East Asia, you have Japan that is developing more. Their economy is robust now based on recent developments. South Korea, when you think about the constructions of the West, I forget the article, but they were pointing out the West isn't just the United States and Western Europe or broader Europe. It's also Australia, Japan, and South Korea. And so they're a part of that. And so I think they're going to be playing a more active role in shaping East Asia, Southeast Asia. I think for South Asia and overlapping Southeast Asia, a lot of it's going to have to be contention on India and how India develops. Under Modi, you see a lot of challenges to free speech, open access to the internet, as well as this push to develop more and to invest in India from other powers so they could counter China. And so I think India is going to be back and forth, and you can't leave out China and their approach to free speech, the internet, and international governance, in which they are looking to play more of a role at the same time that a lot of the challenges they're encountering is decreased access to the most advanced chips and other technologies to help them develop in this race with the United States most prominently.
Wow. So the experience of AI is certainly going to vary based on the region and the world you're on.
Yes.
That's excellent. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Heather. It's an excellent conversation.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. This is wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you.